By 2002, WCW and ECW were dead. WWE was the only game in town, and dozens of wrestlers were out of work. Jeff Jarrett needed a place to wrestle because he'd burned his bridges with Vince McMahon, so he started his own company. Along with his dad Jerry Jarrett, they launched NWA TNA. But because they didn't have a TV deal, they put it on pay-per-view every single week. Yes, they thought it was a good idea to charge $9.99 a week for 2 hours of total non-stop action. They ran these early shows out of the Tennessee State Fairgrounds in Nashville in a small arena that they came to call the Asylum. The first ever episode of NWA TNA was on June the 19th, 2002, although this debut show came from Huntsville, Alabama, rather than Nashville. There were flashes of potential on this first episode. The X Division was introduced, which to be honest was the best thing on the show, and Ken Shamrock was crowned NWA World Champion. Shamrock was one of the biggest names they had available, and it looked like he was going to be a really credible champion, at least to begin with. It would have been really cool if they built the entire promotion around him. It was also really great to see NWA legends on the show such as Ricky Steamboat, and the crowd seemed really into the entire thing. But beyond those positives, episode 1 was a big mess. From Jeff Jarrett cutting a promo about how stupid the show's main event was, to NASCAR drivers getting involved in a feud, to a tag team whose gimmick was literally being dressed as giant penises, it was an absolute disaster. And things didn't get much better as the weeks went on, and that can be blamed on Vince Russo. Yes, the man who helped sink WCW in the year 2000 was now in charge of TNA's creative direction. He was the one writing the show. He got the job thanks to being best buddies with Jeff Jarrett, and his fingerprints were all over the show from the very start. In fact, it was this genius that came up with the terrible name TNA. We all accept it now, but back in 2002, it was a ridiculous title to give a wrestling promotion. It was meant to be a play on tits and ass because Russo believed that controversy and sex appeal were the keys to success. But instead of making the company feel exciting, the name made TNA come across as sleazy right from the start, and people flicking through the pay-per-view channels probably thought it was porn rather than wrestling. When they created TNA, the Jarretts wanted it to be an alternative to WWE, and they had a really good opportunity to achieve that. WWE were treating both tag teams and women's wrestling as a joke at the time, and they could have done a nice job of filling that gap, but Vince Russo wasn't interested in promoting good wrestling. What passed for a women's division was built around the Miss TNA title, which was decided in a lingerie battle royal. The winner ended up being a man called Bruce, who you might remember as Kwee in WCW. His character was that of an over-the-top, effeminate gay man. Francine spent her time having her clothes ripped off, while backstage interviewer Goldilocks was always getting harassed, and porn stars were brought in for segments that went nowhere. And if there was one thing that Vince Russo loved, it was wrestlers with terrible gimmicks. The tag team division was full of them. The Rainbow Express were a pair of ridiculously over-the-top gay men who literally only existed to make their opponents uncomfortable. And then there was the Flying Elvises. Jimmy Yang, George Estrada and Sonny Siaki were actually really good cruiserweight wrestlers, but instead of just letting them be, they were saddled with this terrible gimmick. Then there were the Dups, who were a redneck tag team that made the Godwins look like the Hart Foundation. And who can forget the Johnsons, two men in flesh-coloured bodysuits named Rod and Dick. Apparently, Vince Russo hated tag teams even more than Vince McMahon did. and even when TNA accidentally created a good tag team, they couldn't help but ruin it. AJ Styles and Jerry Lynn were the company's first tag team champions. They were the perfect mix of youth and experience, the kind of exciting tag team they could have built the entire division around. Instead, they turned on each other after just one title defense. TNA refused to let anything breathe. Rather than building up to something meaningful, the company was obsessed with throwing everything at the wall all at once. One of the most infamous examples was the Dub Cup. This was meant to be TNA's version of the hardcore division, but it ended up being a total disaster. The idea was to score points for things like putting someone through a table or shoving their head in a toilet. And then whoever had the most points at the end became the champion. The whole thing was a joke, and like so many of TNA's other ideas at the time, it just disappeared. And of course, who could forget Puppet the Psycho Dwarf? One week he was masturbating in a trash can, and then the next he was pulling a gun on Jeff Jarrett in the middle of the ring. And then there was Ryan Shamrock, who debuted in TNA as part of some mysterious money laundering storyline. Every week she'd be shown collecting cash, teasing that something bigger was coming down the line, and then she just vanished from the company with no explanation as to what the storyline was all about. This happened all the time during the Asylum years. Angles were introduced and then completely forgotten, sometimes in the same week, almost as if Vince Russo was making it up as he went along. And it didn't take long for Russo to start appearing on screen himself. Just like in WCW, he had to make himself part of the show, and quite frequently, he was the centre of the show. This led to the creation of Sports Entertainment Extreme, or S.E.X for short. This idiotically named faction featured a mix of different wrestlers including Jeff Jarrett, B.G. James, Ron Killings, Christopher Daniels, and plenty of others. It was basically a crap version of the NWO, but while the original NWO was trying to take down WCW, S.E.X was battling against the National Wrestling Alliance. The angle dragged on for over 6 months, and just like everything else that Russo was involved in, it was a complete incoherent mess. At one point, they were involved in almost every segment and every main event, and there was no real conclusion to the thing. It's like they'd learned absolutely nothing from WCW. But while the mid-card was a total mess, there were some bright spots in the main event. At the very start, the main event was mostly ex-WWE guys who were well past their prime, people like Scott Hall, Road Dogg, X-Pac, Brian Christopher and Kurt Hennig. Most of these guys didn't last very long because they tended to have lots of personal issues, which was why they were fired from WWE in the first place. Ken Shamrock was one of the most exciting people they signed because at least he had some credibility and he seemed to be sober, but he ended up leaving quite quickly. He won the NWA World title in June 2002 and then he left in August after losing it to Ron Killings. Killings had been a low-card comedy character in the WWF, but TNA turned him heel and he was actually quite good. He got involved in a storyline where he accused NASCAR driver Hermie Sadler of being racist. That angle fizzled out like so much other stuff at the time, but he did become the first ever African American NWA champion, and he successfully defended the belt against the likes of Monty Brown, Low Ki and Jerry Lynn before he was beaten by Jarrett for the title in October. Jeff Jarrett was constantly around the main event since the very beginning of the company, and it got really tiresome to see him all the time. The first few years of TNA was basically the Jeff Jarrett show, but there were plenty of others who came and went. Malice was previously known as The Wall in WCW, and he was pushed early as one of the top heels in the company. I personally thought that he was really effective in the role, but in the end he got a knee injury that cut his career short. Raven was very entertaining during the Asylum years, and he had some of his best moments since he was in ECW. His feud with AJ Styles was one of the most memorable things to happen during the Asylum years. The match between AJ, Jarrett and Raven for the NWA title was excellent. It was the first great match that TNA ever had, and it saw AJ win his first ever World Championship. Of course, AJ would become one of TNA's few homegrown superstars, and he laid the foundations in the X division. Before he became the world champion, Styles was crowned the first ever X champion on the second weekly pay-per-view. Most of the wrestlers in the X division were actually cruiserweights, but the idea was that anyone could compete regardless of size as long as they could perform in a high-energy, high-flying way. It was a really smart idea, and while the rest of the company was a shit show, this was something that was worth tuning in for. TNA got a reputation as time went on for inventing terrible, convoluted gimmick matches, but the Ultimate X match was absolutely fantastic. I've got to give a shout out to America's Most Wanted too. They were something else that TNA got right from the very start, and they were the only truly great tag team on the roster. Chris Harris and James Storm were proper old school ass kickers. So yes, TNA's Asylum years were certainly a mess, and a lot of it was total nonsense, but there were also some really bright spots in there too. Of course, eventually they had to abandon the weekly pay-per-view model, and that was the end of the Asylum era, which led to the creation of Impact in 2004 and what became the golden era of TNA wrestling.